Hello, today is Friday, July 10th. Welcome to episode 615 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. I'm NSI Advisory Board member Lester Munson. I'm joined today by NSI Senior Fellow John Lipsey and Retired General and Ambassador Doug Lute. Before I introduce our special guest, General Lute here, let me say this is a special episode for the summer. We're doing a deeper dive than we normally do. We're still going to try to argue about things and find maybe a bit of humor in the things that we're discussing today. But John and I are intent on doing kind of a regular Friday deeper dive podcast for July and August. We'll see how this turns out. We are thrilled to have as our first guest Doug Lute, who is an eminence grise in Washington. He's as I already said, retired general, retired ambassador to NATO. He was deputy national security advisor in the White House. He's played a number of key roles in U.S. national security over the decades. He is also my colleague at the lobby firm I work in my day job. He's just down the hall from me, and he is in many ways my boss. He is the chair of the practice that I am supposed to be the co-head of. It's great that he's able to join us for a whole bunch of reasons. We're here to talk about the NATO summit that just occurred in Turkey this week. NATO, of course, for those of you unfamiliar, is a treaty organization, has been around for nearly 80 years, arguably the most significant treaty organization in modern history, perhaps world history. It is half of the world's economy. It is the United States and its key allies, Canada, allies in Europe. It is, in many ways, the entity that won the Cold War, the existential battle, ideological and otherwise, between the West and Soviet communism back in the 20th century, which some of us remember acutely well. Doug, I thought I'd just kick it off by asking you, what's your quick take on this week? It seems to me like we got some good news. President Trump said some pretty positive things about Ukraine and about the alliance. Maybe people weren't expecting those things. This issue of F-35s to Turkey kind of got maybe pushed down the priority list a nudge. Interested in your kind of hot take, and then I'm going to throw it over to John for him to kind of weigh in with some questions.
Well,
but
thanks.
Doug,
good to be with you and John and NSI. Over the, as you say, nearly 80-year history of NATO, they occasionally get together at the leaders level, right? As they did this week with the 32 leaders joining the summit hosted by President Erdogan of Turkey. And for each one of these summit occasions, there's really only one outcome that's mandatory. That's absolutely essential. And that is a perception and image of unity, of alliance solidarity. You don't want to leave a summit with divisions, open divisions and divides. And, on that front, I think Ankara will be recorded as successful. I mean, by and large, there's an image here 24 hours later that the alliance is standing shoulder to shoulder to face its perhaps most severe security challenges since the end of the Cold War 35 years ago. So I think the top line outcome of Ankara is positive. However, there are some underlying fissures that President Trump reminded us about. I mean, he reminded us about his unabated ambition with regard to Greenland. He reminded us that he's unhappy with some individual allies with regard to their degree of support for his war against Iran. He reminded us that he remains impatient with the pace at which our European allies are stepping up their ability to actually defend Europe in the lead with us in a supporting role. So there are a number of sort of open issues here, which the president deliberately, I think, reminded his European partners about. But overall, I think we came away saying, all to the good. And basically, I think the Ankara summit will go down as a success.
John.
Thanks, Doug. So I think it appears that one of the reasons that it largely was successful in that sense, and that sort of unified message. And if you look at the communique coming out of the summit, it's quite direct and short, but quite strong about the collective defense, the commitment to the collective defense, and
Right.
to Europe taking on a stronger role within the alliance. Um, Trump got his statement on Iran's nuclear program and the Strait of Hormuz in there, but straight to the point, but quite unified. But it seems that one of the reasons that it was a relatively friendly meeting is that we have seen progress on spending by European allies within the alliance. And that, of course, has been the central objective of President Trump since his first term, is to, bluster and bludgeon his way to much higher levels of spending by European partners. This, of course, isn't new to President Trump. We can go back to successive presidents over generations on this point. I think the team is going to help us splice in some notable remarks from former Defense Secretary Bob Gates as he was leaving government, talking about his concerns about the lack of spending and the threat that posed to the ability of the alliance to sustain itself, and the U.S. To maintain its commitment to the alliance.
I am the latest in a string of U.S. defense secretaries who have urged allies privately and publicly, often with exasperation, to meet agreed-upon NATO benchmarks for defense spending. The blunt reality is that there will be dwindling appetite and patience in the United States Congress and in the American body politic writ large to expend increasingly precious funds on behalf of nations that are apparently unwilling to devote the necessary resources or make the necessary changes to be serious and capable partners in their own defense.
Maybe you can kind of walk us through a bit more of that history of this challenge, this spending challenge, and the new commitments that were agreed to in The Hague last year, and kind of where we are today.
Right. So let me take you back even before last year's spending obligations or spending commitments made. So I was in the chair as the U.S. ambassador when President Obama, all the way back in 2014, was successful as the first U.S. leader to get his NATO allies to agree to a spending commitment. And this was the somewhat inside NATO, somewhat famous Wales pledge, right? And this was a pledge that the allies would move towards spending 2% of their GDP on defense. And in 2014, they gave themselves 10 years to get there, right? So this was an important first time move, but it was pretty modest. I mean, 2%. At the time, I think there were 27 allies at the time, and I think only 3 were at or above 2% at the time that Obama signed on to that pledge. Of course, now we fast forward to last year, and under President Trump, the allies upped that 2% commitment to 5% total, right? And sometimes in public settings like this one, I'm asked, well, who's more responsible? Was it Obama who got the ball rolling, or was it Trump who sort of amplified the message and perhaps in a more coercive way propelled this move towards increased European defense spending? And my somewhat snarky answer is, you got the wrong president. Putin is the president most responsible for European defense spending. And I think that's actually accurate. Back in 2014, the thing that propelled the 2% pledge was the annexation of Crimea in early 2014, the destabilizing of the Donbass region of Ukraine by Russian forces, and the simultaneous challenge on NATO's southern flank in northern Syria and northern Iraq, bordering Turkey, by the physical caliphate of the so-called Islamic State. right? So in 2014, in the first 6 months of 2014, NATO was reminded that its borders may not be as secure as we imagine since the end of the Cold War. And that propelled the 2% pledge. I think Putin is again responsible by way of his 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine for the 5% pledge. Now, you can argue that President Trump's approach has accelerated NATO allies' commitment to 5%, in part because he's been very prominent about this, very political, very, very public about this, but also, I think, on the other side of the ledger, in part because he has also managed to impart a sense of doubt as to whether, while Europe faces a renewed threat from Russia, whether it can at the same time count on the leadership and commitment from Washington. So, yes, President Trump is responsible, but it's not only because he yelled at allies. It's in part because of this lingering doubt that maybe the U.S. is not so ready to lead the alliance and not so ready to be committed. So when you see a communique or a short declaration come out of the Ankara summit that includes upfront a prominent recommitment, a reaffirmation to Article 5, which is that part of the Washington Treaty, the NATO treaty, goes all the way back to 1949, right? That says an attack on one shall be considered as an attack on all. That's very good news. And that line, if we remember anything coming out of the Ankara summit, we should remember that all 32 allies, to include Donald Trump, signed up again for Article 5. But the spending lines here are somewhat distorted because, as good Americans, we imagine this is all about us, right? This must be because America did something. And in my view, much more prominent in terms of propelling a reawakening of European defense spending is what's happening on their eastern flank in Ukraine.
So Putin was a kind of stick hanging out there, and then Trump introduced another one. I mean, of course, Trump's willingness to sort of put that big question into the minds of Europe of whether the U.S. would sustain the alliance and sustain its role, as you said, has played a big factor in increased spending, but also just in the bilateral relationship for the United States with all of its allies across Europe. But this has been, and this is something he started with his first term. We had defense secretaries and others resigning their seats in part because of this uncertainty, that this tactic that the president was pursuing, and his seemingly willingness to follow through on it. I think the question now is, yes, we have a communique. Yes, Trump seems to be happy at the moment, other than with Spain, perhaps. How do you take him at this stage on this point of his commitment to the alliance? Is it has this been a tactical approach of his only, or is there and is the increased spending, has that put us on trajectory for really a revitalized, firm commitment from the United States, or do you think it's clearly still in the minds question in the minds of Europeans to one degree or another? It may be a question in the mind of President Putin. Where would you handicap it?
So I would handicap it that President Trump will continue to be President Trump. And that is, he will approach things like relationships with NATO and relationships with Russia and the war in Iran in a very transactional, day-to-day, unpredictable way. This is his style. It's who he is. I think it probably served him reasonably well in the business world. It is fundamentally in his policy DNA. That he approached things in this transactional way. And so while we can applaud, perhaps briefly, the communique coming out of Ankara, we should remember that this is Donald Trump and he can change his mind today. It's a little surprising he didn't change his mind on the way home on Air Force One when he was talking to the press, right? So we should all buckle in and understand that President Trump prefers this operating style. I think he views it as an advantage. You know, it leaves his options open. He'd prefer, in American football language, to go to the line of scrimmage and call an audible than to follow simply a script, right? What does that mean? That means that European allies will be happy as they make their way home from Ankara, but not satisfied because they sort of dodged a potential bullet at Ankara, where things could have been much more contentious and divisive. They weren't, but I think also recommitted that they have to buy some insurance against this unpredictable Washington, while they also face the largest conflict in Europe since the end of World War II, the war in Ukraine, and the uncertain security situation that a newly aggressive, newly aggrieved, perhaps neo-imperialist Putin presents them on the eastern flank. So to some extent, European allies are looking both east and west, both left and right, and they see uncertainty in both directions.
Can I do my insane outside the box question, which I think is related to this whole conversation, Doug? And I just to give people some context, I spent hours in the library yesterday getting ready for this podcast. No, I didn't. I used my Claude AI functionality to do the work for me. But I did a little digging into because I think this NATO spending, this spending by other NATO countries issue, is a subsidiary of a larger issue that may be the bigger problem, which is our NATO allies have not grown economically the way the United States has. And if you compare to 35 years ago, the end of the Cold War in 1990, 1991 to now, the share of non-US NATO countries of the world economy has fallen by like a third over almost 2 generations. I mean, it's a very significant drop, and which is, you know, I'm not like trying to blame any particular leaders or anything or advocate for a more free market economy in Europe, although that would be a good idea. But the world is different than it was at the end of the Cold War. Turkey has grown massively in its economy, for example, and yes, they're part of NATO, but kind of in a lot of ways an odd man out, even though this summit was in Ankara. Poland is growing. Indonesia is growing. The world is shaped differently than certainly when NATO started, and even at the end of the Cold War, a different world. Are we so my question, the thing that I keep wondering, yes, it's great that our NATO allies are spending more and we're doing 5%, which counts their intel and infrastructure stuff. Very good. Should we be thinking about the alliance itself and the structure of it? Is it still suited to playing the same role in U.S. national security strategy if it represents a significant, granted we're still half the world economy, but it's a significantly smaller portion of the world economy than it was back in 1990.
Yeah, I think your point, Les, underlies or highlights maybe a broader strategic backdrop to NATO and the US, right? And that's what's happening globally. And there's no question that relative to other power centers, American power is gradually diminishing, especially with regard to the rise of China, right? And that, and therefore, Europe's power is adapting as well, and we're undoubtedly moving towards out of the sort of 30 or 35 year pattern of the U.S. being the sole dominant unipolar power center in the world to something that's much more diverse and the power is much more dispersed, right? So we're moving from one global power center which we enjoyed that sort of primary position for decades after the end of the Cold War. But now with the rise of China, with the rise of other power centers like India, for example, and in the course of this global transition to, what some argue will become a multipolar world, Europe is left asking, what about us? Right? And if you look at the EU, so 27 members of the EU, I think 21 of the 27 are also members, allies in NATO, right? So as we move to a global multipolar system, the question posed for Europe is, will Europe be one of those poles? And undoubtedly, economically, the EU and European allies present a bid, right? A bid to be one of those global poles. But what Europe is now doing is stepping up on the hard power front with military capabilities by way of the defense spending, and at least has the promise that it will couple its economic and political power with hard military power and make a bid to be one of these global power structures. Now, that's even if it is increasingly distanced from the US. So that's the inside NATO story is playing out against this broader global backdrop. And I think probably for 5 to 10 years, we're going to be going through this global transition. It is clear that at the end of the day, the US will remain one of the global powers, that China will be, perhaps already is today, a counterpart global competitor. And the question is, who else will join this multipolar scheme? I think Europe is stepping up and has the potential to join. And of course, for Vladimir Putin, his fundamental question in the shifting power arrangement is, what about us? What about Russia? He wants a seat at this global table as well. And part of that is his view that in order to be a global power, he has to control Ukraine. So the broader strategic backdrop to all of what's going on inside NATO is this global power shift. I want to mention one other point, though, since we're on defense spending. It always struck me as a little peculiar that basically the mathematics here can be distorted in terms of comparing defense spending, right? Because we're comparing our entire defense budget with the Ministry of Defense budgets of our European allies. And our defense budget goes to global responsibilities. So space-based systems, our nuclear deterrent, forces in Europe, or forces in the Pacific, forces that will never be available if something happens in Europe, and other forces which we would have no matter our responsibilities in Europe or not, right? So we have a big number as the numerator, right? By comparison, European defense budgets are almost completely committed to Europe itself. So we're not really comparing apples and oranges here. And Europe doesn't tend to highlight that. But if we wanted to be honest, it's probably much more of a level playing field today in terms of resources actually committed to the North Atlantic area.
Doug, you're risking agreeing with me that half of our military budget is in fact a foreign aid budget, that we're spending $400 or $500 billion a year on the world's largest foreign assistance program because it's for everyone's benefit, including ours, but it's for other people's benefit.
It's a common good.
Yeah.
It's a common good.
Yeah.
Right. So when you think about things like space-based intelligence and communication systems or our nuclear deterrent, I mean, those are investments that we would make even if there were no NATO, and yet we count them as NATO investments.
It's a very fair point.
Here that's worth thinking.
In an effort to create a little bit of a fault line discussion here. So that is certainly true, but it is also true that the overall mass of spending feeds the development of capability, a level of capabilities that are unique to the United States that Europe does not possess and would have to invest at a incredibly different level, both in their military, but also, less to your point, just in their broader private sector and economy, to have the type of capabilities that that the United States can and does bring to bear in support of Europe and NATO. This I think helpfully kind of takes us into this NATO 3.0 conversation that the Trump administration is trying to advance, which is sort of the nomenclature and the architecture, I guess, for the a new reformed NATO alliance that has Europe taking more of the lead on the conventional side, with the U.S. bringing its unique capabilities to the table. Maybe, Doug, it'd be helpful to hear your kind of thoughts on what the shape of that looks like today, or may look, how it may come together over time, and to what degree there is consensus around this conceptual framework. I think, like, I just want to point out, I think this conversation at times gets a little silly in that, Doug, you pointed out that Europe has this reinvigorated desire to be a strategic sort of global power, a pole in the multipolar world. But that's also what the U.S. is frankly kind of looking and encouraging them to be more of, to develop the hard power capability. So you have Trump haranguing Europe, saying you have to do more, and then Europe saying, "Oh, this Trump guy, he's risky. We're going to have to do more." And so everybody's basically in agreement, but pretending that they're in opposition, and it's the other person's fault. But it seems like there's much more agreement and consensus around the future of NATO, the future of Europe, than it would seem on the surface. Do you agree with that?
I think that's probably right, at least in terms of the outcome. Now, the motives for moving to NATO 3.0 might be different on different sides of the Atlantic,
Sure.
right? But I think the outcome is similar, and that is, as you say, sort of an increased European capability to defend itself, at least conventional, right? Now, but let's rewind this a little bit, right? NATO 3.0 tries to capture the whole 77-year history of NATO, right? So NATO 1.0 would be the Cold War. So roughly the first 40 years. So 1949 to 1989, when the Berlin Wall falls, that's NATO 1.0, right? It's clear what NATO was created for and what it was about in NATO 1.0, right? It was all about the bipolar standoff between the West and the Soviet Union, right? Soviet Union falls, and the Union itself dissolves in 91, and we move into NATO 2.0. So that's a period of about 25 or 30 years where NATO was essentially unchallenged. And it's this unipolar period where the US was the unquestioned dominant military power in the world. And during NATO 2.0, NATO allies essentially took the peace dividend. They said, look, glory be. Okay, the Soviet Union is no more. The Warsaw Pact is no more. And we can invest in other national priorities. So social programs and so forth. And we can live the good life. And that basically NATO 2.0 lasted at least until 2014. Some would argue with that is the first invasion by Russia of Ukraine and seizing of Crimea and so forth, right? Certainly it was emphasized and crystal clear by 2022 that Europe's ability to sort of rest on American hard power, that was over, right? Because now you had the largest armed conflict in Europe since World War II, and you had Russia, a preeminent military power, openly defying the two principles that underlay the world since World War II, right? So national sovereignty and territorial integrity. In other words, borders count, right? And nations get to choose their own way. And with the invasion of Ukraine, Russia basically tore up the rule book, and Europe finally now is paying attention. And NATO 3.0 is in the design phase. According to the U.S., NATO 3.0 will feature European allies taking the lead responsibility and with capabilities backing it up for the conventional defense of Europe itself. And the US backing away and providing, still actively participating, but providing mostly strategic level enablers, like things that Europe cannot yet provide for itself. So things like overhead intelligence, some offensive cyber capabilities, nuclear deterrence, and so forth, right? The question about NATO 3.0, and we're in the early days. I mean, that term was largely made popular this year, right? So we're in the early days of NATO 3.0. The question is pace. Because if the US moves faster in stepping back to try to promote NATO 3.0, and European allies are not yet in that time able to backfill some of these high-end capabilities, you can imagine a period in NATO 3.0 where you have a strategic gap, where capabilities are actually missing. They've been recovered by the US and they've not yet been fielded by Europe. And that could open up a period of vulnerability.
And we've seen a couple data points on that, to your point, in the last couple of weeks and months. And we saw, it was reported at least, that Secretary Hegseth was about to sort of go forward and announce a significant shift in force posture that got quashed by the White House, and has now announced a 6-month review where he says it'll be coordinated with input from allies and NATO. We'll see how the course of that goes. And then we saw a little bit of a turmoil over the positioning of Tomahawks in Germany and whether that would be done or not. That seems to be a positive outcome of Ankara, is that those Tomahawks will be going forward on the president's order. But maybe you can speak a bit more to that. But to your point on Europe developing and being able to field the type of conventional capabilities that the U.S. Currently does, it has a lot to do with these sorts of both on the missile defense and long-range strike capabilities. And we saw a bunch of announcements around the NATO summit on that front.
Okay, those are two of the capabilities. So the Patriot anti-ballistic missile capability and the Tomahawk long-range cruise missile capability. Those are two of the capabilities that Europe simply doesn't have right now. And as it tools up its defense industrial base to try to replicate those, one of the transition moves would be to actually grant Europe co-production rights on existing US systems, right? So today, the only such co-production arrangement with Patriot is with Germany, right? So we've granted Germany licensing rights to produce Patriot missiles themselves. They're not yet producing, but they have the licensing. There's no such arrangement yet with Tomahawk cruise missiles. So these are two that are worth watching. These are two specific capabilities that are worth watching because they represent very prominently these potential gaps that could exist if the U.S. does not provide and the Europeans are not ready to provide. So these are both worth watching. It's interesting that the president prominently announced that he was going to grant Ukraine co-production authorities for Patriot missiles. And that goes directly to the ongoing fight to try to protect Ukrainian civilian infrastructure from Russian ballistic missiles. There's no other system fielded today that is as effective against ballistic missile strikes as the U.S. Patriot. And most recently, over the last week, there have been some 50 or 60 Russian ballistic missiles that have targeted Ukraine. All of them have gotten through, right? None has been intercepted. That signals to me that while Ukraine's not advertising this, that Ukraine is out of Patriot missiles. So this is a very critical.
Is there a short-term answer for that? Obviously, licensing production of Patriot, like ramping up Patriot missile production, is incredibly challenging to do, or we seem to be making it challenging to do.
Well, this is a problem. This reflects back on the U.S. industrial base, right? So it takes roughly 2 years to go through the full manufacturing cycle for a Patriot missile, right? It's just that complex, and the defense industrial base is that's that's where we're postured right now. And while we've tried to increase our own defense industrial base, we're also expending Patriots at a record high right now. I mean, we expended something like 40% of our stockage in the war, trying to protect our Persian Gulf partners with Patriots against Iranian ballistic missiles, right? So we're expending these things much faster than we produce them. And that's just the U.S. stockpile. So when you go to whom else can we provide Patriots? Well, they're at the bottom of the list. So the U.S. right now can't produce fast enough for its own needs, setting aside those needs of our European allies and Ukraine, and by the way, our Gulf partners as well. So we're expending these faster than we can produce them. And this goes to a phenomenon, I think, that points to NATO 2.0, right? During the post-Cold War period, we tolerated the atrophy of our defense industrial base that we're now coming to grips with. And you can't turn this on and off quickly. And it has to do with, facilities, capital investments like facilities and factories and so forth. It has to do with labor forces, trained labor forces, and it has prominently to do with interconnected supply chains that are vulnerable to supply demands that we simply don't have control of. So think critical minerals, specialized magnets, and so forth, right? All of which are required by these more sophisticated systems. So this is a bigger problem that sort of underlies this move towards NATO 3.0 and the global multipolar system. We have a 2.0 we have a 2.0 defense industrial base, right? Arguing for a 3.0 global posture. And we're simply not there.
Doug, why don't we, by the way, this is really long for fault lines. I think we're over half an hour. This is long for us. Most of our listeners are used to like 10 or 12 minutes. But this is amazing. I feel like we could do it for 3 hours, but we should, yeah, we'll think about wrapping it up here. Let me ask you about one other thing that I find fascinating in all of this, and that's Mark Rutte, the Dutch politician who's now Secretary General of NATO and appears to be the best Trump whisperer in the world, and seems to almost single-handedly keep together the kind of the politics behind these heads of state gathering and, being the balm over a lot of open wounds and that kind of thing, if that's the right metaphor. What's your assessment of Rutte, and are we in a place now where the NATO alliance is a little over-reliant on personalities and less about national interests?
Let me just pile on that briefly. So one of those open wounds is, of course, Greenland, and he appears to have personally committed to the president that he is solving that issue for him. But one of the sort of Greenland is an example of one of the sort of less discussed but very significant undercurrents across the dynamics across relationship around U.S. use of its basing rights and overflight and the like, and it ties together. That was essentially what created Trump's vitriol over Iran and a lot of the opposition by European leaders to the Iran conflict and their limits or restrictions or on the basing rights, and that kind of ties in with the same question over U.S. options in and around Greenland, and then Rutte's personal interventions here to salvage all those. That seems to be one that, and it's one that Hegseth and Colby continue to mention as a critical part of solving NATO 3.0. That seems to be maybe his biggest challenge, but maybe do you think he's up to it, and are we, as Les pointed out, dependent on him to his personality, his sort of political dexterity to solve these things for us?
Well, look, I think Mark Rutte, coming off of 10 years experience as the Dutch prime minister, given all the divisions in Dutch politics, right? He was able to manage the difficult, ever-shifting Dutch political coalition arena in a sort of masterful way, that he's performing a similar role right now as NATO Secretary General. He's managing a very difficult set of diverse political opinions and positions. And I think he's, I can't say that I'm completely personally comfortable with some of his unabated applause of Donald
Daddy.
Trump. I mean, sometimes it's sort of, it does feel like he's sort of over the top here. Okay. But on the other hand, he just delivered Ankara. The NATO did not fracture over Ankara, and it might have, because in the sort of 36 hours of Ankara, Greenland came up, Spain came up, defense spending came up, support for the war in Iran came up. I mean, there were possible fractures there.
And for NATO, he delivered 5%, and he's delivering on the European defense industrial base as well.
He is. And so you could argue that maybe the ends justify the means, and one of his means is a sort of very applauding, almost
the Trump trillion.
The Trump trillion, sort of an obsequious, ingratiating approach to Donald Trump. But look, this is about NATO. And if that's what it takes, I'm sort of on the Rutte team, although sometimes I sort of turn the volume down. But I think, look, Rumsfeld once said, you go to war with the army that you have, not the army you'd like to have. And it turns out, you lead NATO with the Secretary General you have, not the one that maybe the perfect candidate you'd like to have. And I think he's doing, in practical terms, I think he's doing a good job keeping the alliance laced together. And where we started this podcast was that there's really only one outcome from events like Ankara, and that's NATO cohesion. And I think today, just 24 hours after Ankara, we can applaud NATO cohesion. He pulled the rabbit out of the hat.
All right. John, final thoughts.
Well, I think as people look forward, there's, we're hearing more of this discussion around Russia potentially sort of turning up the temperature rather than conceding defeat, potentially, probing NATO's cohesion in Poland or in the Baltics. There's, I guess, the potential that after they have parliamentary elections in September, that there may be some potential for a general mobilization after that. I don't know if, Doug, you have final thoughts on where that's headed, but I think, we're coming out of Ankara with a lot of good vibes. Erdogan gifted everyone with loaded revolvers, which is has been a hysterical scene for all these cosmopolitan European leaders who don't know what the hell to do with that.
All those NATO allies with open carry permits.
Yeah,
right?
Starmer doesn't even know if he can bring it back to the country. But anyway, I guess from my perspective, things seem really good right now. I think we have this hanging question of whether Putin's going to, stress test that in the coming months.
Well, he will stress this. He will stress test this. The good news is that he frankly does not have the conventional military capability to stress test it with a land invasion, right? But he does have the capacity, the air and missile capacity, to challenge NATO if he chooses to do that. I think much more likely he will continue his now multi-year campaign to divide NATO internally by way of means short of Article 5. By that, I mean short of armed attack, short of military attack. So subversion, political interference, election interference, misinformation campaigns, undersea cables, assassination, sabotage, things that are difficult perhaps to immediately attribute back to Russia, but which internally provide him the opportunity to try to cause some chaos, cause some turmoil, cause the NATO, especially European allies, to be sort of self-absorbed with what's going on internally, while he does what he really wants to do by way of trying to subjugate Ukraine, which, by the way, he's failing in doing. So he's got a tough. I would not exchange NATO's hand for his hand. He's got a tough road, and he does face an increasing demand on his manpower, and he faces perhaps a decision to do what he has resisted doing so far, which is a general mobilization, which he knows will bring the war home to in particular, the citizens of Moscow and St. Petersburg, and he wants to avoid that. But the ongoing war in Ukraine is putting a manpower crunch on Vladimir Putin, and that looms on the horizon.
All right. We'll leave it at that. Doug, we really appreciate your time, your wisdom, and willingness to kind of go deep on a lot of these issues here. It's been terrific. Thank you. We're going to call that a wrap. Thanks to Grace Trice, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for their help in producing today's episode. Join us again in 1 week on Friday, July 17th, for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. We're on YouTube. Check out our channel for a video of today's episode. If you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.